What made a road disappear when the sun went down? Why did travelers, desperate to reach their destinations, choose to stop moving rather than continue through the darkness? Tonight, we drift back to a time when roads existed only in daylight, when the simple act of continuing forward became a gamble no reasonable person would take. We'll walk beside those who measured their journeys not in miles covered, but in safe places found before sunset. Before we step into this quiet journey through the fading light on frontier roads, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you're settling in for this passage through history's slower hours, consider tapping the like button and subscribing to Epic Boring History, so these late-night stories can continue to find you. Leave a comment if you'd like. Tell me where you are right now, what hour you're listening in, whether it's deep night or early morning where you sit. Now perhaps dim your screen, let the sounds around you soften into background hum, and we'll begin our quiet walk down roads that ended when daylight did. Imagine yourself on a dirt track that winds through forests you cannot name, carrying goods or letters, or simply yourself toward a destination still days away. The sun has touched the western trees, and already the quality of light has changed. You are not lost, not yet. But you are keenly aware that the road beneath your feet is about to become something different, something uncertain, something best avoided until morning returns. The light is leaving, and with it goes your confidence in the path ahead. You have been walking since dawn, or riding if you are fortunate enough to own a horse, and your body has found a rhythm in the movement, a steady, monotonous forward press that has carried you perhaps 15 miles, perhaps 20, if the road was kind. Now that rhythm must stop. The decision is not dramatic, not announced with worry or fear, but it settles over you with the same inevitability as the cooling air. You begin to notice things you ignored an hour ago. The way the wagon ruts deepen and diverge, how one path might be the main road, and another might lead nowhere useful. The trees that seemed to frame your passage now lean inward, their branches creating a canopy that swallows what little light remains. Your eyes scan the roadside for a suitable place to stop, not too close to the path itself, where anyone else traveling late might stumble upon you, but not so far into the woods that you lose sight of the road entirely. Finding your way back to this spot at dawn is its own concern. The ground is damp. It always seems to be damp, whether from yesterday's rain or this morning's dew, or simply the moisture that rises from soil that never fully dries beneath these trees. Your boots are already wet through, have been for days, and the cold has worked its way into your feet until you barely notice it, except when you stop moving. Stopping is when the cold truly arrives. While you walked, your body generated enough heat to keep the worst of it at bay. But now, as you lower your pack or climb down from the wagon seat, you feel how the temperature has dropped with the sun. The air is still. Too still, perhaps, or perhaps it only feels that way because you are no longer creating your own wind through movement. Sound carries differently now. A bird's call reaches you from an impossible distance, and the crack of a branch somewhere in the forest seems both very near and impossibly far away. You have a decision to make about fire. A fire means warmth, means the ability to heat water or cook something from your provisions, means light that pushes back the darkness for a few feet in every direction. But a fire also means smoke and flame visible from far off, means declaring your presence to anyone else on or near this road. Most nights you choose the fire. The risk of being seen is outweighed by the simple, desperate need for warmth and the small comfort of light. But you build it small, feeding it carefully with dry wood when you can find it, watching the flames stay low and controlled. The wood you gather in the dimming light is often damp, and even the driest pieces are cold to the touch. You arrange them with hands that have grown stiff from holding reins or walking with clenched fists against the chill, and the first attempts at lighting the kindling often fail. When the fire finally catches, it is not the roaring blaze of a hearth, but a tentative, flickering thing that requires constant attention. You feed it one small piece at a time, never letting it grow large enough to consume your fuel quickly, never letting it die down to the point where rekindling it becomes another ordeal. The circle of light it creates is shockingly small, perhaps 6 feet, perhaps 8, if the flames are generous. Beyond that circle, the darkness is absolute. Not the comfortable darkness of a room at night, but a living, pressing darkness that seems to have weight and texture. Your food is whatever travels well and keeps without spoiling. Hard bread, dried meat, perhaps a little cheese, if you began your journey recently enough. You eat without pleasure, consuming what your body needs to continue tomorrow, tasting barely anything, because the cold has numbed your tongue, and the darkness makes even familiar food feel strange. Water is a constant concern. You drink from your canteen or water skin, rationing what remains, knowing you passed a stream hours ago and may not find another until sometime tomorrow. The water tastes of leather and metal, of the container that has held it, and it is never quite enough to satisfy your thirst, but must be made to last. If you have a blanket, you wrap it around your shoulders and sit close to the fire, feeling the heat on one side of your body while the other side grows steadily colder. If you have no blanket, you pull your coat tighter and accept that you will not be warm again until morning comes and you begin moving. Sleep is what you need, but sleep is difficult to find. The ground is hard beneath you, and every root and stone makes itself known through your clothing. You shift position, trying to find some arrangement of your body that does not press painfully against the earth, but there is no comfortable configuration. The sounds of the forest at night are nothing like the sounds of day. Things move in the darkness, animals certainly, though you cannot see them and can only guess at what they might be from the rustling and cracking and occasional calls. Your mind supplies possibilities: deer, raccoons, foxes, bears. Probably deer. Almost certainly deer. But the darkness makes certainty impossible, and so you listen with every sense alert, trying to judge distance and direction from sounds alone. Your body is exhausted, but your mind refuses to release you into sleep. Every sound demands attention, requires analysis. Is that footsteps? Is that something moving closer? Is that just wind or something else? Hours pass in this state, not quite awake, not quite asleep, hovering in some uncertain space where time loses meaning and the darkness becomes eternal. Your fire burns lower, and you rouse yourself enough to add another piece of wood, then settle back into your vigil. The cold deepens. This is the coldest part of night, the hours before dawn, when the earth has released all the warmth it held from the day, and the sun has not yet returned to offer more. You pull your knees toward your chest, make yourself smaller, conserve what heat your body still produces. Your joints ache from stillness after so much movement. Your back protests the awkward position, your neck is stiff, your shoulders tight with tension you cannot seem to release. Every part of you wants to move, to walk, to generate warmth through action, but movement in darkness is its own danger. The road is still there, somewhere just beyond your small circle of firelight. But in darkness it becomes unreliable, untrustworthy. Wagon ruts that were easy to follow in daylight become traps for ankles and wheels. Fallen branches that were simple to avoid become invisible obstacles that could lame a horse or send a traveler sprawling. And the road itself, are you certain where it goes? In daylight you could see how the path curved around trees, how it followed the contour of the land, how it maintained a relatively consistent width and direction. But at night, even with a lantern, you would see only a few feet ahead, would have no sense of whether the path continued straight, or diverged, or simply ended. Stories circulate among travelers about those who tried to continue after dark. The man who drove his wagon off the road in darkness and spent 3 days extracting it from a ravine. The courier who missed a turn and added 50 miles to his journey. The family who continued through the night and arrived nowhere found themselves at dawn in a place they did not recognize with no road in sight. These stories are told quietly, without embellishment, in the tone of simple fact. They require no dramatization because the consequence speaks for itself. Time lost, resources wasted, danger invited through the simple act of refusing to stop. So you stop. Every traveler stops. The rhythm of travel in this time and place is dictated not by determination or need, but by the sun. You move while light permits, and you cease moving when darkness makes movement foolish. Your progress toward your destination will resume tomorrow. Tonight, you exist in this small space between one day's travel and the next, keeping your fire alive, keeping yourself alive, waiting for the sky to lighten and release you back onto the road. The stars, when visible through the trees, offer no comfort. They are beautiful, certainly, and on clear nights they fill the sky with their cold light. But they illuminate nothing useful, cast no light on the path ahead, offer no guidance you can follow. They are simply there, distant and indifferent to your small concerns. You think about your destination, about the inn or town or homestead that waits at the end of this journey. You calculate how many more days of this remain, 3, perhaps 4, if the weather turns. Each day the same pattern. Wake in the cold, move through light, stop when darkness threatens, endure the night. Your fingers are stiff when you flex them, the joints reluctant to bend fully. During the day you barely noticed, but now in stillness, every small discomfort announces itself. Your feet throb with a dull, persistent ache that might be simple fatigue or might be the beginning of something worse. Blisters forming, toes going numb from damp and cold. You remove your boots to check, to let your feet breathe and dry slightly by the fire, but the process is awkward and exposes your feet to cold that makes them sting. The socks, if you have socks, are damp with sweat and moisture that has seeped through leather. You hold them near the flames, trying to dry them without burning them, then pull them back on and replace your boots before your feet lose what little warmth they gained. This is the reality of travel in this time, not the adventure or romance that might be imagined from a distance, but a succession of small, grinding discomforts that accumulate over days until they become your entire world. The romance is absent when your back aches and your stomach is never quite full, and the cold has settled so deeply into your bones that you cannot remember what true warmth feels like. Your thoughts drift as you stare into the flames. You think about the people you are traveling toward, or the business that requires your presence, or the home you left behind and when you might see it again. These thoughts are not sharp or urgent. They float through your mind with the same gentle, unfocused quality as smoke rising from the fire. The night is long, impossibly long. Each hour stretches until you are certain that dawn must be near, and then you realize that no light has yet touched the eastern sky and hours remain. You have lost all sense of time's passage, cannot judge whether you have been sitting here for 2 hours or 5. Your body tries to sleep, despite your mind's vigilance. Your head nods forward, jerks back up. Your eyes close, open with effort. You slip into shallow dreams that are barely distinguishable from waking thoughts. Images of the road continuing, of yourself walking, of destinations that remain always just ahead. And then finally, with a slowness that feels deliberate, the darkness begins to thin. Not light, not yet, but a lessening of the absolute black. The shapes of trees become faintly visible as darker masses against a dark sky. The fire, which seemed so bright in full darkness, now appears dim and tired. You tend it one last time, adding the last of your wood to create enough flame to boil water for whatever passes as breakfast. You eat quickly, efficiently, already thinking about the day ahead and how far you might travel before this same scene repeats itself. The road, when you return to it in the grey light of dawn, looks exactly as it did yesterday evening. The same ruts, the same mud, the same unpromising path stretching forward into forests that seem to have no end. But now, at least, you can see it clearly enough to follow it. You begin walking. Your body protests the movement after a night of cold stillness, but gradually the motion works warmth back into your limbs. The morning is quiet except for the sound of your footsteps and the creak of your wagon if you have one, and you settle back into the rhythm that will carry you through another day. Until evening comes again, and the light begins to fail, and you must make the same decision you made yesterday, to stop before darkness makes the road disappear beneath your feet. There was a man named Josiah Gregg who kept careful records of his travels across the Santa Fe Trail in the 1830s. His journals were not dramatic accounts of adventure, but meticulous documentation of distances, conditions, and the constant recalculation of when to stop moving. Gregg was a merchant by necessity and a writer by inclination, someone who understood that the success of a journey depended less on courage than on accepting the limitations that distance and darkness imposed. He traveled between Missouri and Santa Fe multiple times, leading wagon trains loaded with goods to trade, and each journey taught him the same lesson. Progress was measured in safe camps made before full darkness, not in miles forced through questionable light. His first crossing, undertaken when he was still learning the rhythms of overland travel, was marked by mistakes that became teaching moments. He wrote of an evening when they had pushed too far, tried to reach a known camping spot that his calculations said should be close, and found themselves instead searching for it in deepening darkness. The wagons had slowed as visibility decreased. The oxen, uncertain of their footing on ground, they could no longer see clearly. The drivers had grown tense, aware that a wheel could break or an animal could stumble, and the progress they had gained by continuing would be lost many times over in repairs and recovery. They found the camping spot eventually, but only after an hour of moving at a pace so slow that they might as well have stopped. Gregg calculated that they had covered perhaps 2 additional miles at the cost of exhausted animals, frayed nerves, and a camp made in full darkness that left them unprepared for the night. He did not make that mistake again. His journals from subsequent journeys show a pattern of early stops, camps made while enough light remained to gather firewood and arrange the wagons properly and see to the animals before night settled fully. His entries are repetitive in a way that reveals the truth of travel. The same decisions made daily, the same calculations of distance versus daylight, the same acceptance that forward motion must cease when the sun dictated it must cease. There is no narrative arc to these entries, no building tension or dramatic resolution, only the steady accumulation of days measured in stops made, camps survived, mornings when travel resumed. Gregg traveled during late spring and summer when possible, timing his departures to avoid the worst of winter, but still encountering nights cold enough to make sleep difficult. He described the practice of sleeping under wagons, using the undercarriage as a roof of sorts, the wheels and axles, creating a frame that offered psychological comfort, if not actual shelter. The ground beneath the wagons was no softer than the ground elsewhere, and the space was cramped, but it created a defined space that felt less vulnerable than simply lying in the open. Other members of his wagon trains did the same, creating a camp where each person had their small territory beneath their assigned wagon. Fires were built in the center of the circled wagons when the wagons could be circled, or in careful positions when the terrain made circling impossible. The fires served multiple purposes: warmth, cooking, light enough to see immediate surroundings, and a psychological center that made the camp feel established rather than temporary. Gregg noted how conversations around the fire grew quieter as darkness deepened, how men who talked freely during the day became subdued in the evening. It was not fear exactly, but a kind of watchfulness that did not permit full relaxation, an awareness that they were small and isolated in a landscape that extended in all directions beyond the reach of firelight. His descriptions of night on the trail focused less on danger than on discomfort and tedium. The hours between making camp and falling asleep were long, filled with small tasks that needed doing, and then with waiting for the body to tire enough to sleep despite the conditions. He wrote about the sounds that carried across the prairie at night: wind moving through grass, the occasional call of a coyote, the shifting of the oxen in their makeshift corral. These sounds became familiar over the course of his travels, but familiarity did not make them comforting, only expected. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by cold or discomfort, or the simple difficulty of sleeping on hard ground after days of physical exertion. Gregg described waking multiple times each night, checking the fire, checking the sky for signs of dawn, checking the position of stars to estimate how many hours remained until they could resume travel. The stars themselves became a kind of clock for him, their slow rotation across the sky marking the passage of hours when time otherwise became elastic and uncertain in the darkness. He learned to recognize specific constellations and their positions at different hours of the night, using them to gauge whether it was worth trying to sleep again, or if dawn was close enough that he might as well begin the day's preparations. This astronomical timekeeping was imperfect, complicated by clouds and by his own fatigue-clouded judgment, but it provided a structure to the night that made it feel less endless. When he could identify that Orion had shifted only slightly since he last checked, he knew hours still remained. When the constellation had moved significantly, he knew morning approached. His health suffered on these journeys, as did the health of most travelers. He wrote matter-of-factly about digestive troubles, about persistent coughs, about injuries that could not properly heal because travel continued day after day. The human body, he seemed to understand, was not designed for the kind of sustained hardship that overland travel required. The constant exposure to weather, the inadequate nutrition available on the trail, the lack of proper rest, all of these accumulated into a baseline state of diminished health that every traveler simply accepted as the cost of movement. Yet he continued to travel because the trade he conducted required his presence and because stopping meant the end of his livelihood. His journals reveal a man who had no romantic notions about the trail, who knew exactly how difficult and uncomfortable each journey would be, and who undertook them anyway because the alternative was poverty. The night stops were where the cost of travel accumulated most visibly. During the day, movement provided distraction and purpose. There was always the next landmark to reach, the next mile to cover, the visible progress of landscape changing around you. But at night, there was only stillness and waiting, the slow passage of hours that brought you no closer to your destination. The psychological weight of this enforced idleness pressed heavily on travelers who measured their success in miles covered and goods delivered. Gregg documented the injuries that happened despite careful stopping. A man who stepped on an unseen stone in the darkness and twisted his ankle badly enough to ride in the wagon for 3 days instead of walking. Another who cut his hand while gathering wood in dim light and developed an infection that persisted for weeks. A teamster who grew disoriented in full darkness while checking on the animals and fell into a ravine shallow enough that it had been invisible but deep enough to break his collarbone. These incidents were not dramatic, but they were consequential. Each injury slowed the group, required attention and care, reminded everyone that darkness transformed even familiar tasks into hazards. The economics of night stopping were also documented in Gregg's records. Each day they did not travel was a day of consuming supplies without making progress. The animals needed to be fed, the people needed to eat, and these costs accumulated whether miles were covered or not. The wagon trains carried finite supplies, and every pound consumed without corresponding progress toward the destination reduced the margin for delays or emergencies. This created a constant pressure to maximize daylight hours, to start as early as possible and continue as late as safely possible. But Gregg learned through experience that pushing too hard led to exhausted animals that needed full days of rest to recover, which cost more time than stopping earlier each evening would have cost. The oxen were particularly vulnerable to overwork, their strength enormous but their capacity for recovery limited once depleted. A team pushed too hard would begin to slow noticeably, their pace dropping from the steady plod that covered miles efficiently to a labored shuffle that barely qualified as forward movement. He developed a rhythm that his later journals show he maintained consistently: rise before dawn, prepare for travel while enough darkness remained that lamps were necessary, begin moving at first light, stop when approximately 2 hours of good light remained. Those 2 hours were used to make camp properly, to tend animals, to cook and eat and prepare for night with care rather than haste. This pattern maximized progress while minimizing the risks that came with moving or making camp in insufficient light. It was not dramatic or heroic, but it was sustainable. He could maintain this pace for weeks without the complete exhaustion or accumulating injuries that more aggressive schedules produced. His writings about other travelers reveal the consequences of different approaches. Groups that pushed into darkness consistently suffered more accidents, more exhaustion, more conflict among their members. The stress of navigating uncertain terrain in poor light made people irritable and carelessness on the trail could be costly. Gregg observed wagon trains that arrived at Santa Fe weeks behind schedule because they had suffered preventable accidents in their haste to cover more miles each day. One group he encountered had lost an entire wagon when its wheel broke in darkness, and it tumbled into an arroyo the drivers had not seen until too late. The goods were salvageable but scattered, the wagon damaged beyond field repair, and the delay while they redistributed cargo and sent men back to the nearest settlement for a replacement wheel cost them nearly 2 weeks. Gregg described meeting other wagon trains at stopping points along the trail, comparing progress and sharing information about conditions ahead. These encounters revealed that despite different starting points and different cargoes and different ultimate destinations, all groups followed essentially the same schedule, all stopped when darkness approached, all resumed at dawn. The trail itself enforced this rhythm. There were established camping spots where water was available and the ground was relatively level, and these spots were spaced roughly a day's travel apart. Groups aimed to reach these spots before darkness, and if they arrived early, they stopped anyway rather than continuing to some uncertain location beyond. The known camping spots had been used for years, worn smooth by the passage of previous travelers, the areas for fires marked by old ash, the best positions for wagons identified through collective experience. This created a kind of structure to the journey, a series of fixed points between which travel occurred. Gregg could plan his trips not as continuous movement, but as a succession of these segments, each one beginning and ending at known stops. The night camps became temporary communities, places where multiple wagon trains might gather if their schedules overlapped. Fires would dot the landscape, small circles of light separated by darkness, each group maintaining its own space but aware of the others nearby. There was comfort in this proximity, even without interaction. Knowing that other people were enduring the same night, facing the same cold and darkness and discomfort, made the experience feel less isolating. Gregg wrote that he often found himself more able to sleep when other camps were visible than when his group stopped alone. The distant fires represented human presence, a reminder that the landscape, however vast and empty it seemed in darkness, was traversed by others who shared the same struggles and employed the same solutions. Occasionally, members of different wagon trains would visit between camps, sharing news or trading small items. These exchanges were brief, constrained by the understanding that everyone needed to rest and prepare for the next day's travel, but they provided moments of connection that broke the isolation of the trail. The mornings were always cold, regardless of season. The air before dawn held a chill that penetrated clothing and blankets, and the effort of rising and preparing for travel required forcing the body into motion before it felt ready. Gregg described this as the worst part of each day, not the night itself, but the transition from night to travel, when every part of you wanted to stay still and conserve warmth. The first movements were painful, muscles stiff from sleeping on hard ground, fingers clumsy with cold as they struggled with the tasks of breaking camp. But motion eventually brought its own warmth, and as the sun rose and the day took shape around them, the discomfort of night began to fade into memory. The rhythm of travel reasserted itself, the creak of wagons, the steady pace of walking or riding, the landscape passing slowly by. The sun's appearance transformed everything, not just through the warmth it provided, but through the way it restored definition to the world. Features that had been invisible or ambiguous in darkness revealed themselves clearly, the path ahead evident, the terrain readable, the distance to landmarks measurable rather than guessed. Until evening approached again, and the light began its inevitable decline, and the same calculations began anew. How far to the next known stop? How much light remained? When to make the decision to cease forward progress and prepare for another night? The cyclical nature of this decision-making became so ingrained that Gregg could sense the appropriate stopping time without conscious calculation, his body and mind attuned to the angle of the sun and the quality of the light. Gregg's journals span years of these journeys, and the repetition in his entries is not a failure of narrative but an accurate reflection of the experience. Each night was much like the last. Each stop followed the same pattern. Each dawn brought the same reluctant rising and return to travel. He grew older during these years, and his later entries mention that the hardships he once endured more easily now left him exhausted and slow to recover. The cold affected him more deeply, the hard ground made sleep more difficult, the rhythm that had once been merely uncomfortable became actively painful. His knees troubled him particularly, the constant walking combined with the jarring motion of riding in the wagon, taking their toll on joints that had never been given time to properly heal between journeys. He wrote of mornings when standing required several minutes of gradual movement, his legs refusing immediate cooperation after hours spent curled beneath a wagon. Yet still he traveled because the trail connected him to markets and opportunities that did not exist where he lived. The night stops remained a necessary part of every journey, hours subtracted from progress, but essential for survival. The goods he traded, textiles, tools, manufactured items from the eastern states, could only reach the markets of Santa Fe by being hauled across the prairie, and someone had to do that hauling. The alternative was to abandon the trade entirely to accept a smaller, more limited life constrained by whatever could be produced or acquired locally. In his final years of active trading, Gregg wrote with a kind of weary acceptance about the night camps. He no longer described them with the observational curiosity of his earlier journals, but simply noted them as facts, camped at such and such location, weather clear, resumed at dawn. The reduction of language mirrored the reduction of energy. He had nothing new to say about the experience because the experience had not changed. Only his capacity to endure it had diminished. The stops were the same stops, the darkness the same darkness, the cold the same cold he had felt on his first crossing decades earlier. When he finally ceased traveling the trail, it was not because he had conquered it or mastered it, but because his body could no longer sustain the repetition. The journey had not become easier through experience. He had simply accumulated enough knowledge to minimize its costs while accepting that those costs would always be extracted. His journals ended without drama, without a final grand journey or a reflective summary of what he had learned. They simply stopped, the way each day's travel stopped when darkness made continuing impossible. The abruptness of this ending was itself revealing, suggesting that Gregg saw no particular significance in the cessation of his travels beyond the practical fact that he could no longer undertake them. There was no sense of completing something, only of reaching the point where continuation became impossible. Other travelers left similar records, though few as detailed as Gregg's. Letters home, diary entries, occasional published accounts, all describing the same pattern of movement and stopping, the same rhythm dictated by light and darkness. A woman traveling with her family toward Oregon Territory wrote about the evenings when her children would ask how much farther they had to go, and she would have no answer to give them except that tomorrow they would travel again. Progress was invisible from inside the journey. Only in retrospect, looking back at weeks of these small daily advances, could distance be measured. She described how the children adapted to the routine more easily than the adults, accepting the pattern of stop and start as natural rather than questioning why they could not simply continue until they arrived. For the children, each camp was its own small world, complete and sufficient, not a pause in something larger. They found ways to make the evening stops into something resembling normalcy, claiming particular spots around the fire as their own, developing small rituals around the preparation and consumption of the simple meals that could be cooked over open flames. The children's ability to find contentment in these moments both comforted and troubled her. Comforted because they were not suffering as acutely as she had feared. Troubled because it meant they were becoming accustomed to this hard, transient life. The adults carried the burden of understanding how far remained, how many more nights would be spent on the ground, how many more mornings of forcing cold bodies into motion. This knowledge did not make them better travelers, only more aware of what they were enduring. Her husband kept his own tally of miles covered and miles remaining, a calculation he repeated each evening as they made camp. She noticed that he stopped sharing these numbers with her after the first weeks, recognizing perhaps that the information provided no comfort, only a clearer sense of how long their ordeal would continue. A military courier traveling between frontier forts kept terse records that revealed efficiency born from repetition. His entries noted only the essential facts: departed at dawn, reached such and such creek by midday, made camp at X location, resumed at first light. The stops were functional, stripped of commentary, simply a thing that had to be done. But even in these bare facts, the pattern was visible, the regular stopping, the timing that prioritized arriving at camps with enough light to see clearly, the acceptance that messages would arrive when they arrived and no amount of night travel would significantly change that timeline. The courier's journal contained occasional notations about delays, weather that prevented travel, a lame horse that required rest, illness that kept him in camp for extra days. These interruptions were recorded with the same emotional neutrality as the successful travel days, suggesting a mindset that accepted both progress and setback as equally inevitable components of his work. His route was regular enough that certain camping spots appeared repeatedly in his entries, marked by the same landmarks. Camp at the Bent Cottonwood. Stop at 3 Rocks Creek. Made camp at the burned wagon site. These locations became as familiar to him as the rooms of a house, places he returned to again and again, each visit essentially identical to the previous one. A minister, traveling a circuit between scattered settlements, wrote about using the evening stops for prayer and reflection, trying to make something meaningful from the enforced stillness. He described how his thoughts during these hours turned toward theological questions about the relationship between time and purpose, about what it meant to spend so much of life waiting for dawn. His reflections did not bring him any conclusions, only more questions. The night stops became a kind of meditation, though not the peaceful kind, rather a meditation on discomfort, on the body's limitations, on the vast distance between where he was and where he needed to be. He tried to frame the experience in terms of spiritual discipline, to see the hardship as a form of mortification that might bring him closer to understanding divine will. But honesty compelled him to admit in his writings that mostly he just felt cold and tired and wished to be somewhere else, and that these feelings seemed to have no particular spiritual significance beyond revealing his own weakness. The settlements he served were too far apart for him to stay in any one place and too small to support a resident minister. His circuit required weeks to complete, visiting each small community of believers just often enough to perform baptisms, marriages, and funerals before moving on to the next. All these accounts, different in their details and purposes, converged on the same essential truth. Night ended travel, and travel resumed with light. The roads existed only in daylight. In darkness, they became uncertain territory best avoided. The rhythm of stopping shaped not just the logistics of travel, but the psychology of it. You could not think of a journey as a continuous line from origin to destination, but had to break it into segments, each one beginning and ending at a stop. The journey was not one thing, but many things, a series of days separated by nights that interrupted continuity. This fragmentation made it difficult to maintain a sense of sustained purpose. Each morning required a renewal of commitment to continue, a decision to resume rather than simply remaining where you were. This made distance feel longer, more burdensome. When you measured progress in stops rather than miles, when each day's travel ended with the same discomfort and difficulty, the accumulation of distance felt slow and grudging rather than accumulating naturally. The psychological effect of this rhythm varied by traveler. Some found the structured predictability comforting, a reliable pattern that reduced uncertainty even as it extended the journey's duration. Others chafed against the enforced pauses, frustrated by the knowledge that their destination remained fixed while they were compelled to stop simply because light failed. And yet people continued to travel because connection between places required someone to traverse the distance between them. Messages were carried, goods were traded, families relocated, obligations were met. All of this requiring that people undertake these journeys despite their difficulty. The alternative was isolation, settlements cut off from each other, knowledge and goods and people confined to wherever they happened to be. The trail, with all its hardships, represented connection, difficult, costly connection, but connection nonetheless. The night stops were where the cost of this connection became most visible, where the price of moving between places was paid in cold and discomfort and lost sleep. But the payment was made, night after night, by every traveler on every road. The cumulative effect of these payments was a kind of debt carried in the body, chronic fatigue, persistent minor ailments, the premature aging that hard travel imposed on those who undertook it regularly. Gregg's later photographs show a man who looked older than his years, his face weathered by exposure, his posture suggesting the permanent stiffness that came from too many nights on hard ground. Until morning came and the payment paused and the rhythm of travel resumed its daytime pattern. The dawn represented not rest earned but a temporary reprieve from one form of hardship, exchanged for the different hardship of forward movement. The cycle continued day after day until either the destination was reached or the capacity to continue was exhausted. For most travelers, the destination came first, allowing them to tell themselves they had succeeded, that the journey had been worth its costs. But the memory of the night stops remained, a visceral understanding of what travel required that could not be forgotten or romanticized. Those who traveled the trail once often chose never to travel it again if they could avoid it, and those who traveled it repeatedly did so out of necessity rather than desire. Gregg's account of the Santa Fe Trail stands as one of the most complete records we have of what overland travel meant in practical, daily terms. His meticulous documentation of the mundane, the stopping times, the camping routines, the small injuries and persistent discomforts provides a corrective to the more dramatic narratives that dominated popular accounts of Western travel. Where others wrote of adventure and danger, of hostile encounters and dramatic landscapes, Gregg wrote about calculating when to stop moving. Where others emphasized the heroic aspects of overland travel, he emphasized its tedious, repetitive, uncomfortable reality. This difference in perspective reflects not cowardice or lack of imagination, but a clearer-eyed understanding of what made a journey successful. The dramatic moments were rare and often disastrous. The mundane decisions, repeated correctly day after day, were what allowed travelers to reach their destinations intact. The night stops embodied this principle. They were not exciting, not memorable in themselves, not the stuff of adventure stories, but they were essential, and getting them right meant the difference between arriving safely and not arriving at all. In this sense, Gregg's focus on the night stops was not a failure to recognize more dramatic aspects of trail life, but a recognition that survival depended on managing the undramatic successfully. The trail killed people not through spectacular disasters, but through accumulated small failures, pushing too hard, stopping too late, failing to prepare adequately for the night. His journals teach that distance was not conquered through daring, but through sustainable routine, not through heroic effort, but through the patient acceptance of limitations. The 2 hours of remaining light dedicated to making proper camp, repeated hundreds of times across multiple journeys, represented more practical wisdom than any single dramatic decision could embody. The modern reader, accustomed to travel measured in hours rather than weeks, may find Gregg's journals almost incomprehensible in their focus on stopping. Why document so carefully the decision to cease moving? Why devote so much attention to the arrangements of a temporary camp? But these questions emerge from a context where movement is easy and stopping optional. In Gregg's world, movement was difficult and stopping mandatory, and the quality of one's stops determined whether one survived to reach the destination. The night stops were not interruptions to the journey, but essential components of it, as much a part of travel as the miles covered during daylight. Understanding this requires imagining a world where darkness meant genuine blindness, where continuing to move meant accepting risks that could end not just the journey, but life itself. Gregg understood this world not as concept, but as lived experience, and his journals preserve that understanding in its most practical form. They tell us not what it meant symbolically to travel across the prairie, but what it meant actually, what it required of the body, what decisions had to be made, what costs accumulated. The value of such an account lies precisely in its resistance to drama, its refusal to transform hardship into adventure or suffering into meaning. The night stops were cold and uncomfortable and tedious, and Gregg's willingness to record them as such, repeatedly, without searching for larger significance, gives us access to historical truth that more literary accounts obscure. We learn from his journals that most of overland travel consisted of enduring rather than achieving, of managing discomfort rather than overcoming obstacles, of making the same careful decision to stop day after day until finally the destination was reached and the stopping could end. This knowledge changes how we understand the settlement of the American West, revealing it not as a story of conquest, but as an accumulation of endured nights, not as triumph of will, but as patient submission to necessity. The trail was crossed not because people were brave, but because they were willing to be uncomfortable for weeks at a time, not because they loved adventure, but because they needed what waited on the other side badly enough to pay the price of getting there. Gregg paid that price many times, documenting the payment in journals that strip away myth to reveal the mundane foundation on which westward expansion actually rested. His legacy is not dramatic, but it is true, and truth about the past is rare enough to value highly. The night stops continue in his pages, marking time, measuring cost, recording the patient endurance that made connection between distant places possible. His journals end, but the pattern they document extended beyond his life, continued by other travelers on other trails, the same rhythm of movement and stopping repeated wherever distance had to be crossed without the benefit of speed. And in each of those stops, in the cold and the darkness and the waiting for dawn, the actual price of distance was paid night after night, until finally the journey was complete or the traveler could continue no longer. This was the truth Gregg recorded, and it remains true, unchanged by time or distance from the experiences he documented. There is something almost archaeological about the places where travelers stopped for the night, layers of presence accumulated over years, decades, centuries. The same camping spots were used again and again, marked not by signs or structures, but by their position along the road, by the presence of water or shelter, by some quality that made stopping there feel natural. These places can still be found if you know what to look for. Soil compacted by countless feet and wagon wheels, stones arranged for fire rings and rearranged by each new group of travelers, trees marked where horses were tethered or where travelers carved initials to prove they had passed through. The archaeological record of travel is largely a record of stopping. Movement leaves few traces. A wagon wheel pressed into mud hardens and weathers and disappears. Footprints fade. The act of traveling forward through space creates no lasting mark. But stopping creates accumulation. Ashes from fires, broken tools or discarded items, animal bones from meals, the wear patterns of repeated human presence. These concentrations of material culture form islands of evidence in landscapes where movement itself has become invisible. Excavations at known stopping points along frontier roads reveal this layering with remarkable consistency. Deeper soil holds artifacts from earlier periods. More recent layers contain objects that mark later decades of use. But the pattern remains consistent across time. People stopped at these places because the places offered what travelers needed, and so the same locations drew travelers century after century. The logic of a good stopping place transcended the particular technologies or cultures of any single era. Water was often the determining factor, the single requirement that could not be compromised or substituted. A spring, a creek, a reliable source of drinking water for both people and animals made a location valuable. Travelers planned their daily distances to reach these water sources before darkness, and the spots became nodes in a network of known stops. These networks were passed along through word of mouth, recorded in travelers' diaries, marked on hand-drawn maps that circulated among those planning westward journeys. But water alone did not make a place suitable for the nightly encampments that structured frontier travel. The ground needed to be relatively level for sleeping and for parking wagons. Trees or rock formations that provided some shelter from wind were preferred, creating natural barriers that could make the difference between tolerable discomfort and genuine suffering through a cold night. The location needed to be close enough to the road that travelers could find it even as light failed, but far enough that the road itself did not run directly through the camp. These requirements created a specific geography of stopping, not random points along the road, but carefully selected locations that met multiple criteria. A place might have good water but terrible exposure, excellent shelter but difficult access, level ground but no protection from prevailing winds. Over time, as more travelers used these spots, the locations became established through use rather than through any official designation. The accumulation of ash from fires, the clearing of underbrush, the paths worn between the road and the water source, all of these modifications made the sites more recognizable and more functional with each successive group of travelers. Indigenous peoples who lived in these regions had their own understanding of night travel, developed over generations of moving through landscapes they knew intimately. Their knowledge was different from that of the settlers and traders who followed roads. It was knowledge of terrain itself, of how to read the land in darkness, of which routes could be navigated safely when light failed. But even with this deeper knowledge, the pattern of stopping remained. Movement at night was not impossible, but it required conditions most journeys did not provide: familiarity with the specific terrain, clear skies for navigation by stars, compelling reason to travel rather than wait for dawn. Oral histories preserved in some indigenous communities describe the practice of night travel as something undertaken only when necessary, and then with specific precautions. Travelers would move slowly, test each footfall, remain constantly aware of their surroundings through sound and sensation rather than sight. The techniques described in these oral traditions reveal sophisticated understanding of how human perception operates in darkness. Eyes could be trained to detect subtle variations in shadow, to distinguish between the darkness of open space and the darkness of solid obstacles, but this required patience and practice that few possessed. These stories also contain warnings about the dangers of night movement, the ease of becoming disoriented, the impossibility of seeing hazards, the way darkness transformed familiar landscape into uncertain territory. The warnings were practical rather than supernatural, based on accumulated experience of what could go wrong when movement continued after vision failed. The consistency of these warnings across different tribal traditions and different geographical regions suggests they arose from genuine repeated experience rather than from superstition. When similar lessons appear in communities separated by hundreds of miles, spoken in different languages, embedded in different cultural frameworks, it indicates a common underlying reality to which all these groups responded. European settlers arriving in these regions brought their own beliefs about night travel, shaped by traditions from their homelands. Many of these beliefs carried elements of superstition. Crossroads were considered dangerous places to linger after dark. Certain hours of night were thought to be more perilous than others. Specific landmarks were associated with disappearances or misfortune. These beliefs were rarely articulated as superstition by those who held them, but rather as practical wisdom. Avoid crossroads because they are confusing in darkness, and you might take the wrong path. Avoid the hours before dawn because they are coldest, and you are most vulnerable. Avoid certain landmarks because they are associated with difficult terrain or unreliable conditions. Whether the reasoning was supernatural or practical, the result was the same. Travelers stopped and waited for light rather than continuing through darkness. The beliefs reinforced the behavior that safety already demanded, creating a cultural consensus that transcended any single rationale. Even skeptics who dismissed supernatural explanations found practical reasons to follow the same patterns, and even those with practical objections found their concerns validated by traditional wisdom. Lanterns and torches existed, of course. Travelers carried them. But the light they provided was severely limited. A lantern might illuminate a circle of ground 10 feet across, perhaps less if the night was windy or the fuel was poor. Beyond that circle, darkness remained complete. Walking with a lantern created a small bubble of visibility that moved with you, but it also destroyed your night vision, making everything outside that bubble seem darker by contrast. Your eyes, adapted to the bright flame, could not see the subtler variations of darkness that might otherwise have been visible. The pupil constricted in response to the flame, reducing the eye's ability to gather what little ambient light the night sky might provide from stars or moon. And a lantern announced your presence to anyone or anything that might be watching. The light was visible from far greater distance than it could project useful illumination. A moving flame on a dark road could be seen from half a mile away or more, marking the traveler's position and progress. This created vulnerability that some travelers found more concerning than the darkness itself. In regions where banditry was common, or where tensions between different groups ran high, the decision to travel with visible light became a calculation of comparative risks rather than a simple choice between illumination and darkness. Some travelers preferred to move without light, allowing their eyes to adapt to darkness and relying on the faint illumination of stars or moon when available. This permitted better awareness of surroundings and made them less visible to others, but it also meant moving very slowly and accepting that much of the terrain was simply invisible. Neither approach made night travel truly safe or efficient. Both were compromises, attempts to make movement possible in conditions that fundamentally did not support it. And both approaches travelers learned through experience were inferior to simply stopping until daylight returned. The lessons were often learned the hard way, through falls, through becoming lost, through encountering obstacles that daylight would have made easily avoidable. The archaeological evidence includes the lanterns themselves, broken remains of tin and glass, rusted metal frames, fragments of the tools travelers carried, hoping they might extend the useful hours of each day. These artifacts are found at camping sites rather than along roads, suggesting they were used primarily for making camp and for light around the fire, not for extending travel into darkness. The pattern of their distribution tells a story about how light was actually used in frontier travel. Lanterns cluster around fire rings, suggesting they were employed for tasks around the camp, preparing meals, tending to animals, organizing supplies, rather than for continuing movement along roads. Some stopping places developed into something more permanent over time. Inns were established at locations where travelers regularly stopped, offering beds and meals and shelter for a price. These inns were always spaced roughly a day's travel apart, positioned at the natural stopping points that travelers had been using before any structure existed. The innkeepers who established these businesses recognized patterns that had been created by accumulated traveler behavior, and they positioned their enterprises to serve needs that already existed. The presence of an inn did not change the basic pattern. Travelers still stopped when darkness approached, still measured their progress in days rather than continuous miles. But the inn made stopping more comfortable, providing walls and roofs and warmth that camping could not offer. These establishments were simple affairs, rarely more than a large room where multiple travelers would sleep on cots, or the floor, a kitchen where basic meals were prepared, perhaps a stable for animals. Comfort was relative. You were inside rather than outside, somewhat warmer, somewhat safer, but still sleeping in a room with strangers and still rising before dawn to continue traveling. The social dynamics of these shared sleeping quarters created their own patterns and protocols. Travelers arranged themselves by groups when possible, families claiming corners, merchants sleeping near their goods, strangers maintaining careful distances from one another in the close quarters. The inns themselves became landmarks, points by which distances were measured. 2 days from Miller's Inn meant something specific to anyone who traveled that road. Approximately 40 miles, depending on conditions, broken into 2 segments of roughly equal length. Between inns, travelers relied on established camping sites or found their own stopping places when necessary. A map of frontier roads would show the inns as bright points along the routes, with the spaces between them filled with less formal stopping places used when circumstances demanded it. Not all roads had inns. Newer routes, less traveled paths, roads through territory too remote or too dangerous to support permanent establishments. These offered only what the landscape itself provided. Travelers on such roads carried more supplies, accepted greater discomfort, and measured their journeys in longer units of time. The difference between traveling a road with established inns and traveling a road without them could be significant, not just in terms of comfort, but in terms of the supplies that needed to be carried and the planning required before departure. The cultural understanding of roads included this temporal dimension. A road was not just a path through space, but a structure that existed fully only during certain hours. After dark, the road became something else, something that could not be trusted, something best avoided until light restored its character as a route rather than a risk. This understanding was so deeply embedded in travel culture that it shaped language. Making camp was a phrase that carried no sense of failure or defeat. It was simply what one did when traveling, as natural and necessary as the traveling itself. The day's journey did not end when you reached your destination, because most days you did not reach your destination. The day's journey ended when darkness required you to stop. This rhythm created a different relationship to time than we experience in modern travel, where destinations are expected endpoints and stopping short is viewed as delay or failure. Questions about distance were answered not in miles but in days. How far to the next settlement? 3 days if the weather holds. This answer encompassed not just the physical distance, but the rhythm of travel. 3 periods of daylight movement separated by 3 nights of stopping. The uncertainty built into these estimates was accepted as inherent to travel. Weather could slow progress, road conditions could change, animals could tire or go lame, 100 variables could extend or compress the time required. But the basic unit remained the day, the period of useful light. This way of measuring distance reflected a fundamental truth about frontier travel. The constraints were temporal as much as spatial, and any estimate had to account for both. A 20-mile stretch of good road in summer might truly be a single day's travel, while the same distance over difficult terrain in winter might require 2 or even 3 days. Archaeological surveys of frontier regions reveal the density of these stopping places with striking consistency. Along well-traveled routes, signs of overnight camps appear every 15 to 20 miles, a distance that represents a full day's travel under typical conditions. The consistency of this spacing across different regions and different time periods suggests a fundamental limit to how far laden wagons or walking travelers could reasonably progress in daylight hours. This limit was not arbitrary but emerged from the physical capabilities of humans and draft animals, combined with the number of useful hours that daylight provided across seasons. The spaces between stopping places are largely empty of artifacts. Occasional finds mark where something was lost or discarded during travel, but these are scattered and random compared to the concentrations at camping sites. The archaeology confirms what the written records describe. Travel was movement between stops, not continuous occupation of the road. The landscape of frontier travel was essentially binary, dense accumulations of material culture at stopping places, sparse scattering between them. Some mysteries remain in this landscape of stopping. Isolated sites show evidence of camps made far from established stopping places, in locations that seem poorly chosen. No water nearby, exposed positions, difficult terrain. These anomalous sites suggest emergencies, miscalculations, groups that attempted to continue too far and were forced to stop wherever they found themselves when darkness made further movement impossible. The artifacts at these sites sometimes show signs of haste, fires built in less than ideal locations, minimal camp organization, signs that the travelers departed as soon as light permitted. Other sites show signs of abandonment mid-journey, wagons left beside roads, supplies scattered, evidence of hasty departure. Some of these can be explained by known disasters, by weather events or attacks that scattered travelers. Others remain unexplained, small mysteries preserved in artifact patterns that suggest something went wrong, but provide no clear narrative of what. These abandoned sites create an eerie category within frontier archaeology, places where the normal pattern of stopping was interrupted by something abnormal, but where the specific nature of that interruption has been lost to time. The question of who disappeared between stopping places is one archaeology cannot fully answer. Records sometimes note travelers who departed one location and never arrived at the next, but the reasons for their disappearance are rarely documented. Some explanations are mundane: illness, accident, the decision to turn back or change routes. Others remain uncertain, gaps in the historical record that invite speculation but resist definitive answers. The roads themselves have largely vanished. Pavement covers some, modern highways follow the general path of others, but many frontier routes have returned to forest or grassland, their exact locations lost except where historical maps and archaeological evidence intersect. Walking these vanished roads today, you might pass within feet of a spot where hundreds of travelers once stopped for the night and never know it. The landscape has absorbed the roads back into itself, erasing the paths that once seemed so permanent to those who traveled them. But sometimes the landscape still holds signs: a depression where the ground was compacted, a line of stones that once formed a fire ring, a tree bearing old scars from tethered horses. These traces are faint, easily overlooked, meaningful only if you know what you are looking at and what it represents. Trained archaeologists can read these signs, can reconstruct patterns of use, from subtle variations in soil composition and artifact distribution, but to the untrained eye, the sites are indistinguishable from surrounding landscape. The cultural memory of night travel avoidance faded as roads improved and technology changed. Electric lights, paved surfaces, reliable vehicles, these transformed roads from places that existed only in daylight to routes that could be traveled at any hour. The night ceased to be a boundary that stopped movement. This transformation happened gradually, unevenly, with urban roads changing first and rural routes following years or decades later, but the overall trajectory was clear and eventually universal. But for the century or more when frontier travel dominated American westward expansion, the pattern was absolute. Night meant stopping, daylight meant movement, and the rhythm of this alternation shaped every journey undertaken. The stopping places themselves became part of the infrastructure of expansion, as essential as the roads they served. Without locations where travelers could safely stop, longer routes would have been impossible. The stops were what made the roads functional, what transformed them from theoretical lines on maps into practical routes that actual people could traverse. A road without adequate stopping places was not really a usable road, regardless of what maps might suggest. Understanding this pattern requires accepting that travel was not primarily about movement, but about the relationship between movement and rest, between progress and stopping, between the hours when roads could be used and the hours when they could not. The stops were not interruptions of travel, but integral components of it. Modern thinking about travel tends to privilege movement, to treat stopping as delay or failure, to measure journeys by distance covered rather than by the full cycle of moving and resting that makes sustained travel possible. Frontier travelers had no such illusion. They understood that stopping was not the opposite of traveling, but rather one of its necessary phases. To stand at one of these old stopping places now, if you can find them, if you can identify them among the layers of time that have covered them, is to stand in a space defined by waiting. Not dramatic waiting, not waiting filled with fear or anticipation, but simple waiting for dawn, for light, for the road to become visible and trustworthy again. The darkness that made these places necessary still falls each night, still transforms visibility and certainty into obscurity and doubt. But we no longer stop when it comes, no longer accept its authority over our movement. The roads remain visible now through artificial light, remain navigable through technology that our eyes alone could never provide. Headlights pierce the darkness, streetlights create corridors of visibility, GPS systems allow navigation without visual reference to landscape, removing the need for the kind of stopping that once structured all travel. Whether this represents progress or simply a different set of compromises is a question each person might answer differently. But the historical fact remains, for generations of travelers, darkness ended the day's journey absolutely, and the places where they stopped became as important, as the distances they covered. The archaeology of stopping, the cultural patterns of night avoidance, the accumulated records of travelers who measured their journeys in camps made rather than miles covered. All of this creates a picture of travel defined by its limitations rather than its freedoms. The road was a path that existed conditionally, available only when light permitted, closed when darkness fell. And every traveler accepted this because the alternative was to risk becoming lost, injured, or worse in terrain that darkness had rendered unreadable. The stops were not failures, they were survival, repeated nightly, for as long as the journey required. The physical evidence of these stopping places continues to emerge as archaeological techniques improve and as development occasionally exposes sites that have lain undisturbed for over a century. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding of how travel functioned in this era, what travelers carried with them, how they organized their temporary camps, what they ate and used and discarded. But beyond the specific artifacts, what emerges is a picture of constraint, of human movement shaped by fundamental limits of vision and light, of journeys structured by the unavoidable rhythm of day and night. This constraint was not unique to frontier America, of course. It structured travel in every culture and every era before the advent of artificial illumination, and paved roads made night travel practical. The stopping places of frontier roads simply represent one of the last major expressions of this ancient pattern in what would become modern America. They mark the end of an era in which darkness held real authority over human movement, in which night was not just a time of day, but a genuine barrier to progress. In some ways, the rhythm they represented, movement and rest, progress and pause, effort and recovery, was more aligned with human biology and the limitations of draft animals than the continuous movement now possible on modern roads. Contemporary discussions of driver fatigue, of the accidents that occur when people push through tiredness to continue traveling, suggest that perhaps the forced stops of frontier travel, whatever their origin, served purposes beyond simply avoiding the difficulties of darkness. But we cannot return to that pattern even if we wanted to. The infrastructure exists for continuous travel, the economic and social systems expect it, and the very conception of how travel works has shifted fundamentally. Roads are no longer paths that exist conditionally, available only at certain hours. They are permanent routes, always accessible, always navigable. The old stopping places, then, stand as monuments to a different way of moving through space, a way that accepted limitations we now refuse, that structured time differently, that created rhythms we have abandoned. They are archaeological sites in the fullest sense, traces of a past that was organized according to principles we no longer follow, evidence of how people adapted to constraints we have overcome. To study these places is to study not just travel, but the nature of constraint itself, the ways humans organize activity around unavoidable limitations, the patterns that emerge when certain actions are possible only under specific conditions. The stopping places were solutions to a problem, how to move through space when vision fails, that we have solved differently, through technology rather than through accommodation. Yet something in the pattern they represent persists, even if we no longer enact it on roads. The need for rest, for pause, for rhythm in activity continues to shape human life, even when we have removed many of the external forces that once imposed such rhythm. We may not stop because darkness falls, but we still stop, still create our own patterns of movement and rest, still organize time around the relationship between activity and recovery. The frontier stopping places remind us that this rhythm once had clear external structure, that it was imposed by nature rather than chosen by individuals. Whether that external imposition represented constraint or protection, burden or benefit, is perhaps the central question in considering these sites, not just as historical curiosities, but as evidence of a fundamentally different relationship between human capability and environmental conditions. The The travelers who used these stopping places did not think of themselves as constrained, most likely. They were simply traveling, following patterns that everyone followed, doing what needed to be done to move from one place to another across landscapes that offered no alternative. The constraint was so universal, so completely accepted, that it was simply how travel worked, not a limitation to be lamented, but a reality to be navigated. Only from our perspective, equipped with technologies that allow night travel, does their pattern appear as constraint rather than simply as the nature of things. They would likely find our continuous movement as strange as we find their nightly stops, not better or worse necessarily, but organized according to different principles, responding to different possibilities. The artifacts they left behind do not judge these questions. The fire-cracked stones, the worn ground, the scattered remains of camps made and broken over decades. These simply mark places where people stopped because stopping was necessary, where they waited because waiting was required, where they rested because rest was the only option, until light returned. And light always returned, of course. Morning always came, the road became visible again, travel resumed. The stopping was temporary, a pause in movement rather than an ending of it. But it was necessary temporary stopping, imposed by conditions that could not be negotiated or overcome, and so it structured every journey into a series of movements and stops, daylight progress and darkness waiting, covering ground and making camp. This rhythm was travel in that era, not an obstacle to travel, but its fundamental nature. The places where that rhythm played out, where the stopping happened night after night, remain in the landscape even when we cannot see them, even when they have been covered by forest regrowth or ploughed under by agriculture or buried beneath modern development. They are there still, layers of human presence accumulated over years of nightly stops, archaeological records of a pattern we no longer follow, but which structured movement for generations. To understand them is to understand something about human adaptation, about how people accomplish necessary tasks within real constraints, about the patterns that emerge when certain conditions, in this case, the need to travel and the limitations of human vision, intersect. They are ultimately evidence of problem solving. Travelers found solutions that worked, created patterns that allowed movement across significant distances despite genuine obstacles, and repeated these solutions so consistently that they left traces we can still identify today. The stopping places were the answer to a question, how to travel when darkness falls, that we have since answered differently. But both answers, stopping and waiting versus continuing with artificial light, represent human responses to the same underlying challenge. The frontier travelers solved it with patterns of rest and resumption. We solve it with technology that removes the need for those patterns. Neither solution is self-evidently superior, they simply represent different balances between different priorities and different available tools. What remains constant is the underlying challenge itself. Moving through space requires dealing with the cycle of light and darkness, with the difference between what is visible and what is not. Frontier travelers dealt with it by stopping. We deal with it by creating our own light. The old stopping places mark where one solution was enacted, repeatedly and necessarily, for as long as that solution was the only practical option available. And they remind us, if we can find them and read their signs, that patterns we now take for granted, continuous travel, movement independent of natural light, distance measured in miles rather than days, represent choices made possible by specific technologies rather than inevitable features of how travel must work. For most of human history, in most places and most circumstances, travel meant stopping when darkness fell, and the places where that stopping happened were as essential to the journey as the roads themselves. Not everyone stopped when darkness came. There existed a small category of travelers who continued moving through night hours, who treated the road as something that could be used regardless of light, who had access to resources that transform darkness from an absolute barrier into a manageable difficulty. These were not people of greater courage or skill, but people whose position granted them advantages that ordinary travelers did not possess. The difference was not in the travelers themselves, but in the systems that supported them. Military couriers carried messages between forts and outposts on schedules that sometimes demanded night movement. They traveled alone or in pairs, moving fast on horseback, carrying dispatches that commanding officers had deemed urgent enough to justify the risks of darkness. These riders had several advantages that civilian travelers lacked. They knew their routes intimately, having ridden the same paths repeatedly until every landmark and turn was memorized. They carried minimal supplies, prioritizing speed over comfort, accepting hardship as part of their duty. Their saddles were equipped with specialized pouches designed to keep documents dry and secure, and their horses were selected for stamina and reliability rather than appearance. Most importantly, they had destination points where they would be received regardless of when they arrived. A fort or military post remained staffed through the night, gates could be opened for expected arrivals, and the courier knew that reaching their destination meant shelter, food, and rest. But even these military riders stopped when possible. Records of courier service show that night travel was employed only when necessity demanded it, when orders specified that messages must arrive by a certain time, when weather or other delays had consumed the daylight hours, when the nature of the message made speed essential. The couriers' journals, when they kept them, described night riding as exhausting and disorienting even on familiar routes. The landmarks they relied on in daylight became difficult to identify in darkness. The horse moved more cautiously, uncertain of footing, requiring constant guidance from the rider. The animal's ears would swivel constantly, processing sounds that the rider could barely hear, alert to dangers that remained invisible. One courier wrote about a night ride during which he became convinced he had somehow missed a turn, that he was traveling on the wrong path entirely, only to recognize a familiar landmark when dawn finally broke and discover he had been on the correct route all along. Darkness had transformed known territory into something alien and doubtful. Another courier described the psychological burden of night riding, how the isolation and darkness created a sensation of unreality, as though he existed in some liminal space between the normal world and something stranger. The absence of visual confirmation that he was making progress, that the landscape around him corresponded to what he expected, generated a persistent anxiety that no amount of experience fully dispelled. Military patrols also moved at night occasionally, but under different conditions than couriers. Patrols traveled in groups, heavily armed, following specific orders about where to go and what to watch for. Their night movement was tactical rather than routine, undertaken when surveillance or positioning required it. The soldiers moved with deliberate silence, communicating through predetermined hand signals or whispered commands, aware that sound carried differently in darkness than in daylight. These patrols created their own form of stopping. They would halt frequently, maintaining silence, listening for sounds that might indicate other movement in the darkness. Their progress through night hours was measured in these pauses as much as in forward motion, and they often covered less distance at night than they would have in an equivalent period of daylight. The sensory discipline required for night patrol work was considerable. Soldiers learned to distinguish between the sounds of wind in branches and the sounds of human movement through undergrowth, between animal activity and potential threats. They learned to let their vision adjust fully to darkness, avoiding looking directly at their own campfires or lanterns for hours before a night patrol. The techniques were passed from experienced soldiers to new recruits through practical instruction, through long nights of practice and observation. The military infrastructure that supported these movements was extensive. Forts and outposts were positioned along important routes, creating a network of secure stopping points. A courier or patrol knew that at regular intervals they would find fortified locations where they could rest, resupply, and continue. The forts themselves were constructed with night security in mind: walls that prevented approach without detection, gates that could be secured and defended, elevated positions that provided observation of surrounding territory even in limited light. This infrastructure made night travel less risky but did not eliminate the risks entirely. Couriers still got lost, still suffered injuries from horses stumbling in darkness, still faced the exhaustion that came from extended periods without real rest. The system reduced these risks but could not eliminate them. The military records contain scattered references to couriers who never arrived, whose fate remained unknown, lost somewhere between one fort and another. Government officials traveling on official business had access to similar support systems. A territorial governor or federal agent moving between settlements could rely on military escorts, could commandeer resources at official outposts, could expect communities to receive them and provide accommodation regardless of when they arrived. Their travel was still subject to the limitations of darkness. They could not see the road more clearly than anyone else, could not make their horses move faster over uncertain terrain, but they had options that ordinary travelers did not. If darkness caught them between settlements, they could sometimes demand hospitality from citizens along their route, could invoke their official status to secure shelter. This power to demand accommodation created complex social dynamics. A homesteader living along a major route knew that refusing hospitality to an official could have consequences, that cooperation was expected regardless of the inconvenience or expense it created. The official's arrival disrupted household routines, required sharing limited resources, imposed on families who might have little margin for such impositions. Yet the expectation was so firmly established that refusal was rarely attempted. This did not make government officials immune to the difficulties of travel. Letters written by these officials described the same discomforts, the same cold and exhaustion and poor sleep that civilian travelers experienced. But their position meant they were less likely to spend nights on bare ground, less likely to go without food, less likely to be turned away from whatever shelter might exist. Their journals sometimes reflected awareness of the burden their presence placed on host families, though such awareness rarely translated into changed behavior. Wealthy merchants who traveled with their own wagon trains created their own form of infrastructure. They hired drivers and guards, purchased supplies in quantity, equipped their expeditions with better tools and more reliable animals than ordinary travelers could afford. This wealth did not fundamentally change the rhythm of travel. They still stopped when darkness approached, still made camps each night, still measured progress in days rather than continuous movement. But their camps were better supplied, their stopping places could be chosen with less concern for cost, and they had the resources to recover from setbacks that might ruin less wealthy travelers. A wealthy merchant might hire guides who knew the routes intimately, who could identify the best stopping places and navigate to them even in marginal light. They might equip their camps with better tents, more blankets, higher quality food. These advantages did not eliminate discomfort, but they reduced it to a level that was more bearable. The tents kept out rain and wind more effectively. The blankets provided genuine warmth rather than minimal protection. The food offered nutrition and variety rather than mere sustenance. The difference was visible at shared stopping places where multiple groups camped. The wealthy merchant's camp would have more fires, better shelters, guards posted through the night. The ordinary traveler's camp would be sparse and vulnerable by comparison. Sometimes these camps existed within sight of each other, creating a stark visual representation of social inequality. Abundant resources on one side, minimal provisions on the other, separated by perhaps 50 yards of ground, but by an unbridgeable gulf of economic circumstance. This inequality was accepted as natural by most people of the time. Wealth had always granted advantages, and the advantages it provided to travelers were simply another expression of broader social stratification. No one expected travel to be equally difficult for rich and poor. The social order that governed settled life was understood to extend to the road as well, to shape the experience of movement just as it shaped the experience of stasis. But the darkness itself was equalizing in certain ways. A wealthy merchant traveling alone at night was just as vulnerable as a poor farmer, just as unable to see clearly, just as likely to become disoriented. Wealth could purchase better preparation and support, but it could not fundamentally alter what darkness did to the road. The human eye responded to the absence of light in the same way regardless of the social position of its owner, and no amount of money could create artificial illumination powerful enough to transform night into day. Church officials and missionaries traveled under yet another set of conditions. They often moved along established circuits, visiting communities in sequence, and these circuits created a network of expected arrivals and departures. Communities along the circuit knew approximately when to expect the traveling preacher or priest, and would offer hospitality as part of their religious obligation. This expectation was reinforced through religious teaching that emphasized the duty to welcome travelers, particularly those engaged in spiritual work. This created a form of infrastructure built not on military or commercial foundations, but on social and religious ones. The traveling minister knew that at each stop they would find a place to sleep, food to eat, and people who considered their presence valuable enough to offset the cost of hosting them. But this system only worked along established circuits. A church official traveling through unfamiliar territory or on a journey that deviated from their usual route lost these advantages and became just another traveler subject to all the usual difficulties and uncertainties. The missionary letters that survive describe a peculiar duality in their experience. Within their circuits they moved with relative comfort and security, welcomed and hosted, their nights spent in homes rather than on the ground. But when establishing new routes or traveling to remote areas, they faced all the hardships that any traveler encountered. The contrast between these experiences was often stark. One week, sleeping in beds provided by congregants, the next week, sleeping on the ground in unfamiliar territory, uncertain of where the next meal would come from or where safe shelter might be found. Some missionaries wrote with surprising frankness about this disparity. One described the shock of moving from a well-established circuit where his arrival was anticipated and prepared for, to a frontier region where his religious authority meant nothing to settlers who had no connection to his denomination. The loss of the social infrastructure that had supported his travel forced him to confront the reality that most travelers faced constantly. His religious role, which had seemed to grant him a kind of privileged status, revealed itself as contingent on social structures that existed only in certain places. Postal riders represented another category of privileged travelers, though their privilege was limited and their work demanding. They followed established routes between post offices, carrying mail on schedules that the Postal Service attempted to maintain regardless of conditions. These riders were expected to travel through difficult weather and long hours, to maintain pace even when exhausted, to prioritize the mail's delivery over their own comfort. They stopped at designated stations where they could exchange horses, take brief meals, and then continue. The postal system attempted to create an infrastructure that would support continuous movement, with stations positioned at intervals that a rider could reach in a few hours. This system worked imperfectly. Stations were sometimes poorly supplied, horses sometimes unavailable, riders sometimes forced to continue beyond what was safe or reasonable. Night travel was part of the postal rider's expected duties, but even the Postal Service acknowledged the difficulties it created. Schedules allowed more time for routes that required night riding, recognizing that progress after dark was slower and less reliable than progress in daylight. Riders who carried mail at night did so with better equipment than ordinary travelers, higher quality lanterns, horses trained to follow familiar routes with minimal guidance, detailed knowledge of every stop and landmark along their assigned paths. But equipment and knowledge only reduced risks. They did not eliminate them. The lanterns available to postal riders were more reliable than the simple devices most travelers carried, with better fuel reservoirs and more effective reflectors. But even these improved lanterns created only a small sphere of visibility, leaving most of the surrounding landscape in darkness. The horses, though trained and experienced, remained animals capable of fear and mistake. A postal horse that had traveled a route dozens of times might still shy at an unexpected sound, might still stumble over an obstacle invisible in darkness. The injury and death rates among postal riders were higher than among the general traveling population, a direct result of the demands placed on them to maintain schedules regardless of conditions. The system required that they take risks that ordinary travelers could avoid by simply stopping and waiting for better conditions. The Postal Service kept records of these injuries and deaths, though they were rarely published or widely discussed. Families of postal riders understood the dangers, accepted them as part of the occupation, but that acceptance did not make the losses less painful when they occurred. Stagecoach drivers represented a commercial version of these pressures. Stagecoaches ran on published schedules, and passengers expected to arrive at their destinations at stated times. This created pressure on drivers to maintain pace even when conditions made travel difficult. The companies that employed them emphasized reliability and punctuality, understanding that their commercial success depended on meeting the expectations they had created through their published timetables. Stagecoaches carried multiple passengers, creating a situation where the driver's decisions affected not just themselves, but everyone in the coach. A driver who chose to stop early or travel slowly would face complaints from passengers anxious to reach their destinations. A driver who took risks to maintain schedule might satisfy passengers but endanger everyone aboard. This tension between safety and service shaped every decision a stagecoach driver made, particularly as daylight faded and the choice between continuing or stopping became urgent. The companies that operated stagecoach lines attempted to support night travel by positioning stations and inns along their routes, by employing drivers who knew the roads intimately, by maintaining the vehicles and horses to higher standards than private travelers could afford. But the fundamental limitations of darkness remained. Stagecoach accidents occurred disproportionately at night or in marginal light conditions. Coaches overturned when wheels struck obstacles invisible in darkness. Horses bolted when startled by sounds they could not identify. Drivers misjudged turns or distances and found themselves off the road entirely. These accidents were reported in newspapers and discussed in communities along the routes, creating a public awareness that night travel carried risks even within the most developed transportation infrastructure of the time. The accidents did not stop night stagecoach service, but they created ongoing tension between schedule demands and safety concerns. Some accidents became famous, their details recounted and embellished through repeated telling. A coach that overturned on a mountain road, killing 3 passengers and injuring 5 others, became a cautionary tale told throughout the region. A driver who misjudged a turn in darkness and drove his coach into a ravine, surviving himself but losing 2 passengers, found his story repeated whenever the dangers of night travel were discussed. These narratives served both as entertainment and as warning, reminding people that the infrastructure of organized travel did not guarantee safety. Passengers traveling by stagecoach experienced a different relationship with stopping than other travelers. They were not making the decision themselves. The driver and the company's schedule determined when and where the coach stopped. Passengers simply endured whatever the schedule required, sleeping in the coach if it traveled through the night, stumbling into roadside inns for brief stops when the schedule permitted. The experience was often deeply uncomfortable. Seats designed for sitting became torture devices when sleep was attempted. The coach's constant motion and noise prevented genuine rest, and the presence of other passengers meant no privacy and little space. The wealthy and powerful who traveled by private coach had more control but faced similar limitations. A private coach could stop when and where its owner preferred, could maintain whatever pace seemed appropriate, but it still could not see through darkness or navigate invisible terrain safely. Some very wealthy individuals attempted to create fully equipped traveling households with servants, supplies, and multiple vehicles forming a small expedition. These impressive displays of resources still stopped when darkness approached, still made camps each night, still acknowledged that wealth could not fundamentally overcome what darkness did to the road. The most privileged travelers of all were those who could simply choose not to travel when conditions were poor. Government officials who could postpone journeys, merchants who could delay trips until weather and seasons were favorable, church authorities who could send subordinates in their place. These people experienced travel's difficulties, least because they experienced travel itself less frequently. But even those who rarely traveled, who had the privilege of remaining stationary while others moved on their behalf, understood the rhythms that governed overland movement. They knew that messages took days to arrive, that goods shipped from distant places required weeks or months to reach them, that the speed of travel was limited by factors that no amount of money or authority could eliminate. The infrastructure that supported privileged travelers, military forts, postal stations, coaching inns, church circuits, represented significant social investment in making travel more reliable. These systems emerged because travel was necessary for governance, commerce, communication, and cultural cohesion. But even these systems accepted darkness as a limitation rather than attempting to eliminate it. The forts closed their gates at night. The coaching inns provided places to stop rather than ways to continue. The postal stations marked intervals in a journey rather than enabling continuous movement. A military fort positioned along a major route made that route safer for everyone, not just military personnel. Civilians traveling past a fort knew they were relatively close to aid if emergency struck. The fort represented civilization's claim on the landscape, an assertion that this territory was known and controlled rather than wild and uncertain. The visible presence of military architecture, walls, gates, guard towers, created a psychological effect that extended beyond the fort's immediate defensive capabilities. But between forts, the wilderness reasserted itself. The road might be well-traveled, might be wide and clear, but it remained vulnerable to darkness in ways that military presence could not prevent. Travelers between forts were on their own, subject to the same limitations that affected travelers on routes where no forts existed. The distance between military installations defined the extent of secure travel, created zones of relative safety, separated by zones where travelers relied on their own resources and judgment. The inns that served stagecoach lines also served ordinary travelers, though at prices many could not afford. An inn might have rooms reserved for stagecoach passengers and officials, but it usually had space where less wealthy travelers could sleep on the floor or in the stable. The presence of the inn made that stopping place more desirable for everyone, even those who could not afford its services. A traveler sleeping in the stable still benefited from the structure's shelter, from proximity to other people, from being at a recognized stopping point rather than an isolated camp. This created a pattern where the infrastructure built to support privileged travel provided residual benefits to ordinary travelers. A road maintained for military movement was easier for civilian wagons. A postal route marked for postal riders provided orientation for others. A coaching inn, positioned for paying passengers, created a landmark and potential shelter for those traveling independently. But the fundamental pattern remained. Everyone stopped when darkness approached. The privileged stopped in better conditions with more comfort and security, but they stopped. The infrastructure reduced the severity of stopping, but did not eliminate the necessity of it. The night remained a barrier that wealth and position could mitigate, but not overcome. As night settled over the landscape, the various categories of travelers all enacted variations of the same behavior. The military courier found shelter at a fort. The wealthy merchant made camp with hired guards posted. The postal rider reached a station and exchanged horses. The stagecoach pulled into an inn. The government official secured hospitality from a citizen. The ordinary traveler found a spot off the road and built a small fire. Different circumstances, different levels of comfort and security, but all fundamentally doing the same thing, ceasing forward movement because darkness made continued travel too risky or too slow to justify attempting it. The morning would bring different experiences as well. The courier would leave before dawn if duty required it. The merchant would direct the breaking of camp. The postal rider would mount a fresh horse. The stagecoach would resume its schedule. The official would continue their official journey. The ordinary traveler would pack their minimal gear and return to the road. But for the hours of darkness, they were all stopped, all waiting, all subject to the same fundamental limitation that darkness imposed on human movement through space. Privilege changed the experience of waiting, but did not eliminate the waiting itself. The wealthy merchant waiting in a tent with blankets and a brazier experienced the night differently than the ordinary traveler huddled near a small fire, but both were waiting. The passage of night hours felt different depending on comfort level, but the hours themselves passed at the same rate for everyone. Dawn arrived at the same moment for the privileged and the ordinary, ending the period of enforced stillness with the same slow increase of light across the landscape. Over time, the infrastructure improved. More inns were built, more stations established, more routes marked and maintained. The network of supported travel became denser and more reliable, but it remained a network of stops as much as a network of roads, places where movement could be sustained because places existed where movement could pause. The travelers who benefited most from this infrastructure were often those who contributed least to its creation. Wealthy merchants funded coaching companies that built inns for their own use, but ordinary travelers also used those inns. Military establishments created forts for security purposes, but civilian travelers sheltered near them. Postal services built stations for their riders, but others recognized these as landmarks and stopping points. In this way, privilege created a landscape that partially served everyone, though unequally. The elite shaped the infrastructure of travel to meet their needs, and in doing so created structures that reduced the difficulties of travel for others as well, if only incidentally. But the gap between elite and ordinary travel remained vast. A government official moving between settlements might spend no nights on the ground, might sleep in beds and eat prepared meals, and be received as an honored guest at every stop. An ordinary farmer traveling the same route might spend every night on bare earth, might subsist on hard bread and preserved meat, might find no welcome at any door. The official's journey was punctuated by moments of hospitality and comfort. The farmer's journey was an unbroken sequence of hardship and exposure. Both would cover roughly the same distance each day. Both would stop when darkness approached. Both would measure their journeys in days rather than miles. The rhythm was the same even when the experience differed dramatically in comfort and security. And when night fell, when darkness transformed the road into uncertain territory, even the most privileged traveler experienced something of the vulnerability that ordinary travelers felt constantly. The darkness did not respect rank or wealth, did not illuminate the path more clearly for those of higher status. A lantern carried by a government official cast the same limited circle of light as a lantern carried by a farmer. The stars visible to a wealthy merchant were the same stars visible to a poor migrant. The cold that settled into the night affected all bodies similarly, regardless of the social position those bodies occupied during daylight hours. Human physiology responded to temperature and darkness according to biological laws that were indifferent to social hierarchy. This common vulnerability was rarely acknowledged explicitly, but it shaped the culture of travel in subtle ways. Even privileged travelers developed a certain humility born from experiencing their own limitations in the face of distance and darkness. Even those who traveled with every advantage understood that the road demanded respect, that movement through space carried inherent risks that wealth and status could reduce but not eliminate. This understanding manifested in small ways, in the tone officials used when discussing travel conditions, in the respect wealthy merchants showed to experienced guides, in the willingness of all travelers to share information about road conditions and dangers. The stories told about travel reflected this understanding. Tales of misadventure and difficulty were shared among all social classes, with the implicit recognition that anyone who traveled risked encountering similar problems. A story about a wealthy merchant who became lost was structurally similar to a story about an ordinary traveler who became lost. The details might differ, the consequences might be less severe for the wealthy merchant, but the fundamental situation was the same. Both narratives involved the experience of disorientation, of being unable to determine one's position or direction, of confronting the possibility that help might not arrive in time. As darkness fell along the roads, as countless travelers enacted their nightly stopping routines, the landscape filled with small fires and temporary camps marking where movement had paused. Some camps were elaborate, some were minimal, but all represented the same acknowledgement that this was how travel worked: forward movement during light, stillness during darkness, resumption at dawn. The privileged travelers in their better camps, the ordinary travelers in their sparse ones, the couriers and drivers and officials and migrants and merchants, all waiting for morning, all measuring their journeys in days, all subject to the rhythm that daylight and darkness imposed on human movement through space. The accumulated effect of all these individual stopping decisions created a predictable pattern across the landscape, a daily cycle of movement and rest that repeated with the reliability of natural phenomena. And when dawn came, when the sky lightened and the road became visible again, they would all resume. Different paces, different destinations, different levels of comfort and security, but all moving forward during the hours when the road could be trusted, all accepting that when darkness returned, they would stop again. This was travel in the time before artificial light transformed the night, a rhythm of movement and stopping, a pattern that even the most privileged could modify but not fundamentally escape, a relationship between darkness and rest that shaped every journey undertaken. The infrastructure that supported privileged travel was impressive in its scope and organization, but it remained an infrastructure built around stopping rather than an infrastructure that eliminated the need to stop. The military courier, riding through darkness toward a distant fort, was not defying the night, but moving through it with support systems that made such movement survivable. The postal rider, maintaining schedule through twilight hours, was not overcoming darkness, but accepting calculated risks that the postal service deemed worthwhile for the sake of reliable communication. The wealthy merchant's elaborately equipped camp was not a rejection of the need to stop, but rather an accommodation to that need made more comfortable through the application of resources. Even the most privileged travelers remained fundamentally subject to the limitations that darkness imposed on all human movement. The roads themselves bore witness to this pattern. The worn tracks, the established camping spots, the positioning of infrastructure, all reflected the reality that travel consisted of stages bounded by darkness, that forward progress was measured not in continuous miles but in a series of daily advances. The landscape organized itself around this rhythm, with human settlements and support structures positioned at intervals that corresponded to what could be traveled in daylight hours. This was not conscious planning in most cases, but rather the accumulated result of countless individual decisions about where to build, where to stop, where infrastructure was needed. The privileged travelers who moved through this landscape were both its beneficiaries and its creators. Their needs drove the development of military posts, coaching inns, postal stations. Their resources funded the construction and maintenance of these facilities. Their use of these facilities justified their continued existence and expansion. Yet even as they shaped the infrastructure of travel to serve their purposes, they remained bound by the same fundamental constraints that limited all travelers. They created systems that made stopping more comfortable and more secure, but they could not create systems that eliminated the need to stop. The difference between elite and ordinary travel was therefore a difference of degree rather than kind. Both categories of travelers experienced the same basic pattern of movement and rest, of progress and pause. Both confronted the same darkness when night fell, the same uncertainty about what lay ahead in the unseen portions of the road. The privilege of elite travel lay not in escaping these realities, but in having better resources with which to manage them. This understanding was embedded in the practical knowledge that experienced travelers accumulated. A government official who had made the same journey multiple times learned the same lessons about pacing and preparation that an ordinary traveler learned, even if the official's superior resources made the consequences of poor planning less severe. A wealthy merchant who traveled regularly developed the same instincts about when to stop and where to camp that any experienced traveler possessed, even if the merchant's camps were more comfortable than those of ordinary travelers. Experience taught similar lessons to all travelers, regardless of their social position. The seasonal patterns of travel affected privileged and ordinary travelers alike, though again with different consequences. Winter travel was dangerous and difficult for everyone, though the wealthy could better afford to delay until conditions improved. Summer travel was more feasible but brought its own challenges of heat and drought that affected all categories of travelers. Spring and fall offered the best conditions, and travel volumes increased during these seasons as both privileged and ordinary travelers took advantage of moderate weather and reliable road conditions. The infrastructure of supported travel reflected these seasonal patterns. Inns and stations expected higher traffic during favorable seasons and reduced activity during winter. Military posts adjusted their staffing and supply levels based on anticipated courier traffic, which varied with season and weather. The entire system of travel breathed with these seasonal rhythms, expanding and contracting in response to conditions that no human agency could control. As night enclosed the landscape as the various categories of travelers settled into their respective stopping routines, the shared nature of their fundamental situation became evident. Different tents, different fires, different levels of provision and security, but all engaged in the same basic activity, waiting out the darkness because forward movement had become too risky or uncertain to continue. The hours of night passed slowly for some, quickly for others, depending on comfort and state of mind, but they passed at the same rate for all, bringing dawn eventually to everyone who waited. And with dawn came the resumption of forward movement, the continuation of journeys that would extend through the daylight hours until darkness once again required stopping. This was the pattern that governed travel in the pre-electric era, a pattern that infrastructure could modify but could not break, that privilege could soften but could not escape, that remained constant across all the variations of social position and circumstance that differentiated one traveler from another. We have traveled together through the fading light, walked beside those who measured their journeys in safe places found before sunset, rather than in miles conquered through determination. The road that existed so clearly in daylight disappeared when darkness came, not because the physical path vanished, but because the certainty it offered could not survive without light. Think for a moment about the distance we have covered tonight, not in space but in understanding. We began with the simple fact that travelers stopped when the sun went down, and we have seen how that simple fact shaped everything about the experience of travel, the planning, the pacing, the infrastructure, the very language used to describe distance and progress. The travelers we have walked beside, the ordinary ones making their careful camps, Josiah Gregg documenting his stops across the Santa Fe Trail, the communities who gathered at established stopping places, the privileged few who moved with support but still acknowledged darkness as a boundary. All of them accepted what we have forgotten. That movement through space is not primarily about will or determination, but about working within the limitations that the physical world imposes. Darkness was one of those limitations, as absolute in its way as a mountain range or an ocean. You could not simply decide to overcome it through effort or courage. You could only accept it, plan around it, and wait for the conditions that made movement possible to return. There is something almost peaceful in that acceptance, in the recognition that some things cannot be forced or hurried. The travelers stopped because continuing was foolish, and in stopping, they aligned themselves with a natural rhythm older than roads or wheels or any human invention meant to speed movement through space. We live now in a time when that rhythm has been broken, when artificial light has extended our useful hours beyond what the sun provides, when roads are marked and lit and navigable at any hour. We can choose to travel through the night if we wish, and we often do, measuring our progress in continuous motion rather than in the stops that once structured every journey. This is progress, certainly. The ability to move regardless of light, to reach destinations faster, to be less subject to the limitations that governed our ancestors, these are real advantages that have reshaped how we relate to distance and time. But something has been lost as well, though perhaps lost is not quite the right word. Something has been made invisible to us, the understanding that movement and rest are not opposites but partners, that stopping is not failure but wisdom, that the darkness that once ended every day's travel was not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be respected. The travelers who stopped when light failed were not weak or timid. They were practical, experienced, aware of what their bodies and animals could endure and what the road could support. They knew that the miles they might gain by continuing through darkness would be paid for many times over in exhaustion, accidents, or the simple stress of navigating uncertainty in conditions that made navigation unreliable. Their stopping places, scattered across the landscape at intervals dictated by daylight and distance, created a geography of rest. These places were not destinations but pauses, not achievements but necessities. Yet in their accumulation they shaped the experience of travel as much as the roads themselves did. Imagine yourself one more time at one of these stopping places. The fire is low, carefully tended to provide warmth and light without consuming fuel too quickly. The darkness presses close beyond the small circle of illumination. Your body is tired from the day's movement, but sleep comes slowly because the ground is hard and the cold is persistent and the sounds of the night keep pulling your attention outward. You are uncomfortable, certainly. You would prefer to be at your destination, in a bed, warm and secure, but you are also doing exactly what the situation requires, waiting for conditions to change, conserving your energy for tomorrow's movement, accepting the rhythm that travel imposes. There is a kind of wisdom in this that our current approach to travel has largely abandoned. We push forward regardless of conditions, force movement to continue when perhaps rest would be wiser, measure success in distance covered rather than in sustainable pace maintained. The travelers who stopped each evening understood something we have forgotten, that the journey is not separate from the stopping, that progress includes the periods of stillness, that the ability to arrive safely depends as much on knowing when to cease movement as on knowing when to begin it. As you settle into your own rest tonight, wherever you are listening to these words, you are engaging in your own version of what those travelers did each evening. You are stopping, ceasing the movement and activity of the day, accepting that some hours are meant for stillness rather than progress. Your bed is softer than the ground those travelers slept on. Your room is warmer than their camps. You are safer, more comfortable, more secure in countless ways. But the fundamental act is the same, the recognition that the body and mind require rest, that some form of stopping is necessary for any journey to continue. The roads those travelers used have mostly vanished now, returned to forest or covered by pavement or simply forgotten as newer routes replaced them. But the pattern they created, movement and stopping, progress and rest, the rhythm of days structured by light and darkness, remains embedded in how we understand journeys and destinations. We measure our own travels differently now, in hours rather than days, in continuous movement rather than accumulated stops. But beneath our changed methods, the old truth remains. No journey proceeds without pause, no movement continues forever, no progress happens without periods of rest that allow progress to resume. The travelers who avoided the roads after dark were not avoiding adventure or shirking challenge. They were simply being realistic about what could be achieved in darkness and what should wait for light. They were prioritizing survival over speed, sustainability over heroic effort, the completion of the journey over the conquest of any single day. Their camps each night were small surrenders to limitation, acknowledgements that human ability has boundaries that wisdom respects rather than defying. And in the morning, when those limitations lifted with the returning light, the travelers resumed their forward movement without drama or declaration, simply returning to the road because the road had once again become something that could be safely traveled. This pattern, repeated across generations, across thousands of miles of frontier roads, through countless individual journeys undertaken for countless different reasons. The details varied endlessly, but the rhythm remained constant. Move while you can see. Stop when darkness makes seeing impossible. Rest until light returns. Then move again. We have followed this rhythm together tonight, moving through segments and stories, pausing to consider details, then continuing forward through the narrative. And now we arrive at our own stopping place, the point where this particular journey through history reaches its natural pause. The travelers are still out there, in a sense, not literally, not alive, but present in the traces they left, in the patterns they established, in the understanding they developed about what travel required and what darkness demanded. Their experience is distant from ours in time and in comfort, but not in its essential truth. They knew something worth remembering, that movement is not always possible, that some conditions require waiting, that the darkness that ends each day is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be accepted. They stopped when stopping was wise, and in doing so they survived to continue their journeys. As you drift now toward your own rest, let the image of those travelers settling into their evening camps accompany you. See them arranging their small fires, wrapping themselves against the cold, accepting the discomfort because it is temporary and necessary. Hear the sounds they heard, wind moving through trees, the crackle of flames, the distant calls of animals moving through darkness. Feel the hardness of the ground beneath them, the chill in the air, the weight of exhaustion accumulated through the day's travel. And feel also the gradual release of tension as the body acknowledges that movement has ended, that this night will pass as all nights pass, that morning will come, and with it the resumption of forward progress. The road is still there in the darkness, invisible but present, waiting to be traveled when light returns. The destination is still ahead, no closer than it was when darkness fell, but no farther either. Time passes through the night, but the journey itself has paused, suspended in the hours when movement cannot safely continue. And in this suspension, in this waiting, there is a kind of peace. Not the peace of completion or arrival, but the peace of accepting what is, that this is where you are, that this is when rest comes, that tomorrow will be different, but tonight is for stillness. The travelers understood this. They did not fight against the darkness or resent the stopping it required. They simply stopped, made what preparations they could for the night ahead, and waited with whatever patience they could summon for the conditions that would allow them to continue. You can do the same now. The journey you are on, whatever journey that might be, whatever destination you are working toward, will still be there tomorrow. Tonight is for rest, for the kind of stopping that those travelers practiced every evening, for the acknowledgement that forward movement is not always possible and should not always be forced. Let the darkness be what it was for them. not an enemy or an obstacle, but simply a condition that called for different behavior, for stillness instead of movement, for rest instead of progress. Let the night be a stopping place, a pause between the movement of today and the movement of tomorrow. The fire is dying now in those long-ago camps, burning down to coals that glow faintly in the darkness. The travelers are settling into whatever sleep the conditions permit, their bodies finding what comfort they can on the hard ground, their minds releasing the concerns of the day and drifting into the formless space between waking and sleep. You can join them in that drift, letting your own thoughts become as unfocused as theirs, letting the boundary between consciousness and sleep become as blurred as the boundary between the firelight and the surrounding darkness. There is nothing more that needs to be done tonight, no distance that must be covered, no decision that cannot wait for morning. The road will be there when light returns. The journey will continue when continuation is possible. But for now, there is only this, the stopping, the waiting, the slow surrender to rest that every traveler must make when darkness falls and the road disappears into night. Sleep well, traveler. The morning will come as it always does, and with it, the light that makes movement possible again. But that is tomorrow's concern. Tonight belongs to rest, to the stopping that sustains all journeys, to the darkness that teaches us when to cease our forward press and simply be still. The fires are going out now, one by one, in camps scattered across a landscape that exists now only in memory and traces. The travelers are finding what sleep they can. The night is long, but it is not endless. Dawn will come, but dawn is not here yet. For now, there is only the quiet, the darkness, the waiting. Let yourself wait with them. Let yourself stop as they stopped. Let yourself rest as they rested. The road can wait, tomorrow can wait. Everything can wait while the darkness holds, and the night does what nights do, offers rest to those who have traveled, and promises nothing except that morning will eventually break, and the journey, if you choose, can continue. Rest now. The stopping place is found, the night has come. And in the morning, if you wake, the road will still be there, ready for those who are ready to travel it. But that is not tonight's concern. Tonight is for rest. Deep, full rest, the kind that those weary travelers sought each evening, the kind that makes tomorrow's movement possible. Rest.